Okay, please keep open the outline you have on your Sakai schedule. Near the bottom, we have a little bit about Roman epic history. This is the concluding video for the 4th week of the Greek mythology class, and it should be a fairly brief one. I'm just going to touch upon a little bit of the history of Roman epic. Now, recall from a previous video that epic in the Greek world referred to first of all, poetry that was written very specifically in the dactylic hexameter meter. Just to remind you, this is what the meter sounds like. And the first epic poet we have, of course, is Homer, and contemporary with him was Hesiod. And then there are some other epic poems in Greek times written later, such as one by Apollonius of Rhodes called the Argonautica, which is just a 4-book description of the travels of Jason to go get the golden fleece. So we had, and of course there are others besides, but we have those as epics. And remember that epic specifically in the Greek world referred to a long mythic poem in that particular meter, describing gods, heroes, great men, and great events, usually with some momentous time-changing occurrence like the Trojan War, the destruction of the city of Troy by the Mycenaeans. So also remember that Greek literature starts approximately 800 BC or a little later with Homer, so therefore right at the beginning of the Archaic Age. Now, Roman literature actually starts quite a bit later. And actually, prior to that, we don't really have the occurrence of any Latin literature. So the official date for the beginning of Roman literature is 240 BC, and that's a fixed date. We have that from excuse me, later authors, Cicero and Quintilian, to confirm that that was the first date that any Roman literature of note was in fact composed. And the first author was someone named Lucius Andronicus, and he composed tragedy and comedy for the stage, but quite different from the way that the Greeks composed tragedies. That's something we cover in our Greek ancient comedy course, in fact, 391, another shameless plug. In addition, Andronicus also used a meter that was developed locally in Italy. It was not the original Roman meter, and it was called the Saturnine meter. And in that meter, he composed a whole translation of Homer's Odyssey. So then after him, there was another poet named Gnaeus Naevius, and Gnaeus Naevius took his hand at epic again, but this again he used the Saturnian meter, and he composed a poem called Bellum Punicum, or the Punic Wars. So the Saturnine meter turned out to be a very complicated one to use, and it was one that poets eventually wanted to replace. So the first poet who successfully gave up on the Saturnine meter and really started composing works in real epic meter was this fellow, Quintus Ennius, whose dates are 239 to 169 BC. So you'll notice that he's born a little bit after that initial date of 240 BC. So therefore, he's really at the forefront of Roman literature of all time. And he therefore becomes a real pioneer, especially for epic, because he composed 2 kinds of works in that same dactylic hexameter. One was a whole epic description of Roman history that ran year by year before his time. It was called the Annales, A-N-N-A-L-E-S, and it was a yearly description in poetry, in dactylic hexameter, of Roman history. We have a few lines of it surviving, including parts describing Titus Tatius, the Sabine king, whom we remember had to take on Romulus after the rape of the Sabines. And we have other fragments that show its structure. It's not particularly good poetry. That may be the reason why it didn't survive, maybe. But the later orator, philosopher, and scholar Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote extensively about the history of Roman literature and praises Ennius, as we say, as the pioneer, the one who got Roman epic writing on the map, even if he himself was not especially successful in his own particular effort, the fact that he made the effort to try to compose epic poetry in Latin was an immense achievement. Now, Ennius also composed a very special kind of literature as well that was later perfected by this second author, Gaius Lucilius. It was also in the same epic dactylic hexameter, but it was a very different type of genre. It was called satire. Now, you might jump and think, well, I know what satire is. Well, not really, because this is a little bit different. Satire is from the Latin word satira, which means mixed up. It's like a tossed dish of, say, salad or anything that is all mixed together with a whole bunch of jumbled elements put together rather randomly. It also is related to the word for fullness, satis, like enough of something, so our word satisfaction in English. So now, satira is therefore basically a mixed form of literature. And it really can be on any subject that the author chooses. So in a way, it's kind of the blog of its day. Truthfully, if the Romans had had the internet, and especially all of our social media, they would have been totally, completely at home with it. It would have been quite amazing if some of the Roman campaigns could have been carried out with cell phones, truthfully. But in any event, the satire was the best that they had at the time, and it was quite a successful art. You had to be a bit careful, though. The Romans, unlike the Athenians under Aristophanes, had a sense of humor, but with limits. You could not necessarily come out directly and say something really bad about somebody. So, that same poet we mentioned, Gnaeus Naevius, wrote a short poem in which he basically calls the family of the Metelli senators all jerks. And that family wrote a little poem back in which they basically said to Gnaeus Naevius, boy, are you really going to get it. He ended up getting thrown in jail. And to show us the impression that that made, we have a comedy by a slightly later author named Plautus, in which one of the characters on stage, who's of course the character in the story, all of a sudden breaks out of character for a moment and says, I want to say a certain thing here, but I'm a little bit nervous that if I do that, the poet who created me might get in trouble like another certain poet who went to prison. It's a beautiful piece of meta theater, and it shows that the Roman authors were aware that a Roman satirist's bark was really a lot worse than his bite. He really had to be kind of careful what he was going to say. Despite all that, though, Gaius Lucilius wrote books and books of satires. Again, it's unfortunate we don't have a lot of them surviving, but we can tell from the fragments that he wrote on many different subjects, and he could be very, very critical of Rome when he needed to be. This, of course, was the period gradually that got into that period with the Gracchi brothers, and then later on, a little bit of Marius. He died too early to see the Marius-Sulla conflict. But he could see that things were developing in the Roman state in a not particularly good way, and he had some things to say about that. So, of course, you do realize that if Rome all of a sudden had ever woken up and suddenly had become this wonderful, beauteous place like a Garden of Eden, satirists would all be out of business. They'd be unhappy. So, there's always a downside to everything, right? All right, so Gaius Lucilius was the next writer of epic. Bear in mind that by the original definition of epic, satire wouldn't qualify as real epic, but it is indeed a demonstration of the use of the epic meter, the dactylic hexameter. We go next to the author you've heard me mention before, Titus Lucretius, the one who wrote about the nature of things. This also would not qualify as epic. This is more similar to Hesiod's poetry, called didactic, D-I-D-A-C-T-I-C, didactic, meaning educational poetry. However, it's another step in the process. Lucretius did his best with the composition of Latin, did a lot better than Ennius in some ways, had his troubles still, especially with the use of vocabulary, which he complains about, that he does not have as wide a vocabulary to choose from as equivalent Greek authors would have had, but he does his best. So it did indeed take until Virgil before we finally see the epic meter really brought to its fruition. We have Virgil, We also, just as a coda to wrap up this video, we have Horace, who also was a satirist, like Lucilius, who also therefore wrote in the epic meter for satire. And we have later satirists also. We have Persius, and we have the really, really exuberantly critical Juvenal. Persius wrote under Nero, and Juvenal wrote later under Emperor Domitian. But we also have other epics. We also have Lucan, who wrote a work called the Civil War, which was basically a kind of satiric piece on Virgil's Aeneid, basically going through Roman history after the period that Virgil wrote about down into the Civil War period in order to demonstrate that Roman history really hadn't lived up to its potential very well. So that's just a very quick history about epic, and that concludes our videos for the 4th week of Greek mythology, and we're coming back next week for the 5th week. We're going to look at Ovid, his Metamorphoses, our final author, and then we'll get into our final video, and then we'll at last start reviewing for the final exam. So I'm really excited. We're almost done with the course, and I hope it's been a worthwhile journey for you. We'll see you here on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend.